Welcome to today's AgeWell webinar. My name is Alison Schneider, and I'm the Education and Training Manager at AgeWell, Canada's technology and aging network. Today, we will explore understanding accessibility and AgeTech. So we are clinically look at what accessibility means in the context of AgeTech in this webinar. We're excited, as you can see, to have Sam Sandasi, our Director of Education and Training at AgeWell, here with us to lead this important discussion. So a few housekeeping items before I turn things over to Sam. So this presentation will last for about 50 minutes, we hope. We do hope to have a Q&A session to follow, so please be sure to post any questions or comments for the Q&A in the chat or in the Q&A box. We will get to those questions after Sam's presentation, and if we don't get to your question, we will try to follow up and provide an answer to you. So maybe put it in the chat if you have an email that's not the one you registered with. You can send that to the host and panelists privately. At the end, during the Q&A, you can also raise your hand to ask a question verbally, and you can enable closed captioning in Zoom, and that's located on the toolbar. This webinar is being recorded and will be available for replay on AgeWell's members intranet and YouTube channel. So without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to Sam to begin her presentation.
Thank you so much, Allison. Can I get a thumbs up that you see my shared screen? Awesome. Thank you so much. All right, so now I'm going to hide that Zoom screen a little bit. So it might be difficult for me to see if you put a question in the chat box right away, but hopefully we'll be able to get to them later. So as Allison said, my name's Samantha Sandasi. I'm the Director of Education and Training at AgeWell, and I've been with AgeWell for about 10 years now, and I've been able to really see how the network has grown and changed and how we've changed our focus or increased our focus a little bit to look at things like social justice through AgeTech and what that means. So I'm joining everyone today from Burlington, and just to see if everyone's awake, please put your location in the chat box. Let's see how that goes. Is anyone going to join me with that? Hamilton. I grew up in Hamilton. Awesome. Kingston. I did my PhD in Kingston. Fabulous. Toronto. Technically, I work in Toronto, but I'm not there today. So this webinar is really meant as an introductory session to accessibility and AgeTech. And it's actually a topic that we now have an online course on, and will actually also be, oh, hello, Martin. It's a pleasure to have you join us. I want to give a shout out to our former colleagues at AgeWell, Ash McCaskill and Michaela Dirtle, for helping to really develop the content for our Understanding Accessibility course, as well as to Virginie Kobico at the University of Ottawa and her open collaboration for cognitive accessibility team that have developed an inclusive research for cognitive accessibility course that's also available through AgeWell. So for those of you that are interested in learning more about these topics, please do reach out to training@agewell-nce.ca, and my colleague Allison, who you just heard from, can help you get involved in these courses or get enrolled in these courses to learn more. All right, first question. So the reason I really wanted you guys to put your locations in there is to see if we can get some answers in the chat box as well. So let's start with a question. What do we think about when we talk about accessibility? What do we mean by accessibility? See if we got a couple of answers in the chat box. What's accessibility? All right. Ease of use, not consistently excluding the same groups. Those are great. Those are fantastic starts. Access to everything for everyone and inclusiveness. Wonderful. Thank you. So when we think of accessibility, a lot of people often discuss them in terms of things like ramps and elevators and washrooms. They're not thinking as inclusively as you guys are thinking in the chat box right now. So while ramps and elevators and washrooms and things like that, the built environment is super, super important, When we think about accessibility in age tech, this includes designing products, technologies, and services that enable people of differing abilities to participate fully in society. There are almost 8 million older adults in Canada, 7.8, and 1 in 5 Canadians live with a disability. As age tech researchers and designers, understanding accessibility it's crucial, right? Without it, we will unintentionally or intentionally create technologies that exclude or even harm the populations we're seeking to support. So the first thing I want to say, and as like a really key takeaway here, is that this webinar is a call for us, for all of us, to take a consciously inclusive approach and to think really deeply about the intersecting barriers to inclusion and exclusion so that we can intentionally design products, environments, and systems that are usable by all people to the greatest extent possible without the need for adaptation or specialized solutions. Not only is this more ethical and effective, it's also more scalable, right? So a focus on accessibility in this way is a powerful way to maximize our real-world impact. Now, for the rest of our time together, I'd like to focus on a few things. First, I want to talk a little bit about rules and regulations and acts in Canada. Then we'll dive into the meat of our webinar a little bit more. So we'll talk about the digital divide and a model that can help us think about the various barriers to digital inclusion experienced by older adults. And last, we'll talk a little bit more about some practical strategies to improve accessibility. And I'll introduce something called the Access Rainbow, which is an older framework from the 90s, actually, that is still really relevant to help us as researchers and designers to think a bit deeper about how to address real-world challenges. All right, back to the chat box, guys. Is accessibility enforceable by law in Canada? Yes or no? Or even just a Y and an N? Yes. Yes, AODA. Yes, I believe so. So it's overwhelmingly yes. But like all things in Canada, it's yes, but it's a bit complicated because we need to look federally, we need to look provincially or territorially, and even municipally too. So let's start federally. We have the Accessible Canada Act, or Bill C-18, and that was enacted in 2019 with a goal to create a barrier-free Canada by 2040. So this act actually creates accessibility standards for federally regulated institutions and organizations. So these are things like banks, the Federal Transport Network, so that includes like airlines, rail, road, marine transportation providers, broadcasting, things like, or organizations and places like the House of Commons and Senate and things like that. Related to this, we also have the Accessible Canada regulations and also Accessibility Standards Canada. They've also established the Accessibility Commissioner and a Chief Accessibility Officer. And these are roles that were created recently to help push for progress in accessibility and to figure out enforcement. So one really big win here is that federally regulated institutions and organizations had to create and share accessibility plans by 2024. So that's small businesses, large businesses, crown corporations, you name it. And moving forward, they have to publish progress reports on their work towards meeting accessibility goals and regulations as well. There are a couple exceptions to this. So businesses that have fewer than 9 employees and First Nations band councils are currently exempt. In the First Nations case, they'll actually be working towards a more expansive plan that they'll put into place later on. Now, provincially is where it gets really complicated because it's different across the country. Some, but not all provinces have acts, some have developed standards, some have legislation to enforce the standards. In Ontario, in BC, and Manitoba, we have provincial-wide accessibility standards. So those in Ontario, Sydney put in the AODA, the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act. That's a key legislation that we have in place. Other provinces have enacted accessibility legislation and are also working towards accessibility standards to apply to the private sector. So these are provinces like Saskatchewan, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Newfoundland and Labrador, and Quebec, for example. I'd like to point out that Alberta doesn't have a provincial accessibility legislation in place yet, but it does have some related legislation. For example, they have other acts that are focused on addressing specific aspects of accessibility. So, for example, they have something called the Service Dogs Act. PEI and Northwest Territories likewise don't have provincial or territorial accessibility legislation either. So things can get a bit dicey there. Municipalities have bylaws, they have standards, and they have guidelines related to accessibility. For those of us in and around Toronto, we might be aware that the City of Toronto has published the Toronto Accessibility Design Guidelines, and those are best practices for organizations to use to conduct things like accessibility audits and to plan for barrier-free development in a physical environment very specifically. So when we talk about accessibility and digital inclusion, which is what the focus of this presentation will be, and when it comes to AgeTech, like what are we talking about here? It's more than ensuring that you use, appropriate colors and approved fonts on your website. Digital inclusion cuts across all 7 of these key priority areas here that you see that are identified in the Canada Accessibility Act. So things like employment, the built environment, communication, information and communication technologies, procurement, programs and services, and transportation. And that leads to my first call to action here. Get familiar with the policy context of your research and your work. A lot of the time, policy is this black box that researchers and tech designers don't really poke at until it becomes a question of, is it legal to market this? And even then, sometimes that very basic question isn't even asked until a product is launched. For those of you who've heard me speak before when I do design thinking sessions, you've heard me use the example of the Segway, those 2-wheeled scooters that were touted a long time ago to support mobility and tourism. Yeah, those things are illegal on sidewalks and on roads. And the same goes for those e-scooters that you see your kids have. My kid has one. Those are illegal to use across most sidewalks in Canada too. So knowing the policy context of what's allowed, what's legal in terms of a product as you're iteratively designing it is kind of the least you can do. And that leads me to my second call to action. Go beyond the law. I'd like to highlight that I said go beyond the law, not outside of it, because regulations in some instances are kind of the lowest bar you're required to hit. So if you can do better, do better. Aside from thinking about it as a moral imperative, creating a really truly accessible product increases your market size, and that impacts your bottom line. Right, so I'm going to get off my soapbox now, and let's talk about how we can do better when it comes to older adults and digital inclusion. It helps to consider, I think, what we call the digital divide. And the digital divide, as you can see here, is defined as the gap between those who have access to and can effectively use digital technologies and those who cannot. This divide affects many populations, and it's particularly relevant to older adults because they tend to be portrayed as this unified whole of non-digital or non-tech inclined humans. And that assumption is totally an oversimplification that reinforces ageist assumptions. It frames older adults as incapable of using technology rather than acknowledging that there are real barriers out there that limit use or participation. As researchers and designers in age tech, we need to acknowledge that older adults aren't just tech adverse. We can't blame them for the lack of success of our products. We really need to explore these barriers to inclusion instead, right? So if you take a look at this slide, almost 3/4 of Canadian older adults feel confident using current technology. 82%, or actually closer to 83% of Canadians aged 65 and older use the internet. Those aged 75 and older, 72% use the internet in some way. But I must say that this could be basic things like reading the news, email, or social media like Facebook. It's not really clear how in-depth that knowledge is, but the use case is there. So the problem then isn't just ability, there's more to it. And a lot of those problems come from us. They come from the system, they come from designers. So I want to look at a couple real world examples. So this is a smart city policy in the city of Edmonton. So in this year, 2025, the city of Edmonton transitioned its parking system to mobile-only payments, and they removed in-person payment kiosks across the city. You guys can imagine that this could have caused a little bit of chaos, and you're welcome to put some of these thoughts in the chat box. Because while the move was intended to streamline operations and modernize urban infrastructure, it got a lot of criticism very quickly from Edmontonian residents, especially those older adults and those without smartphones, those without individual data plans with their phones as well. They were unable to pay for parking. So this is an example of how a change that could sound positive or be well-intentioned can unintentionally create new barriers. When cities shift essential services to digital-only formats, they risk excluding those who are already underserved and make everyday activities like parking in this instance, or making appointments, renewing your license plate, participating in community life significantly more difficult. Now let's do another example. Has anyone been to an emergency room lately? What was that wait time like? What about booking an appointment with a family doctor, if you even have a family doctor? Yeah, our health systems are heavily burdened and they're increasingly struggling to meet the needs of the Canadian population. As our population continues to rapidly age, you can imagine that things without some sustained change are just going to get worse. So enter virtual care. Last year, Kai reported that a third of Canadians who received primary care in 2023 did so virtually. So virtually in this case means appointments by video, so a video call like we're doing right now, through over the phone or through a secure messaging system. As you can imagine, virtual care can improve access to primary care by allowing patients to see a clinician without having to travel. And this can be of particular benefit to individuals like older adults who statistically need to and do access the most primary care. In addition, it could be a huge benefit to those who live further away from their primary care providers, right? Those in rural or remote areas. As this figure shows, about 9% of emergency department visits could have been, a Zoom with a primary care physician or nurse. So the increase of virtual care could actually impact positively lots of different areas, not just primary care, but also emergency departments as well. So this is pretty amazing, yes? And I think this is absolutely amazing and totally valuable. But the reality is that the folks living in rural and remote areas of Canada, people who can benefit the most from access to virtual care, so they don't have to drive, 6 hours to see the doctor or rehab, those folks don't have strong internet because there's a lack of local infrastructure. As researchers and designers, we need to think about the accessibility of our products and services in a few different dimensions. So it's not just, as I said before, whether the font on our app is large. It's also whether or not people have access to the infrastructure that makes our products and services usable. And I can't help myself here, but this is an example. This example is a really excellent argument for the internet as a human right. So I'm going to put that out there. All right. There are intersecting barriers to digital inclusion. The barriers are never just one-dimensional, however, and they emerge through an intersection of three different things: personal capabilities, social and technological environments, and the activities themselves, what those look like. Many older adults in Canada face personal challenges and situations that affect their ability to engage effectively with technology. And this can include things like reduced vision, hearing, dexterity, anxiety and low confidence when learning new tools, There are almost 5 million individuals, not all older adults in Canada. So 5 million individuals in Canada who live with a cognitive disability, for example, and this can include memory-related challenges. When these particular personal factors intersect, they can create a deeply personal experience of disconnection. And these challenges are amplified by the fact that many digital interfaces aren't designed with aging users in mind. So, the small fonts, yeah, for sure, but complex navigation and frequent updates that can lead to things like confusion and frustration. Environmental barriers. These also play a pretty significant role, and they include things like the affordability of devices and internet services, lack of access to tailored training, and limited support systems. Older adults with lower income or educational attainment, for example, are less likely to have internet access or the digital skills needed to navigate online platforms. In Canada, older adults are among the groups most affected by unequal access to broadband infrastructure, particularly in remote rural communities, right? And then social support is another critical factor here. Older adults living alone or without tech-savvy family members or friends may struggle to find help when issues arise. And then the activities themselves. These can be things like using a digital healthcare portal. So we've all seen the move to Epic, as in the electronic medical record system. Things, everyday things like renewing a bus pass, banking, attending a virtual event like this one. Everything's increasingly digital. But without accessible designer supports, what should be a really simple task can become a stressful or impossible task. And as more services go digital by default, older adults who cannot access them are placed at a higher risk of social exclusion, of health inequalities, and the loss of independence. So ultimately, though, I have to stress this, digital exclusion isn't just a matter of age. It reflects a much broader pattern of inequality, right? We're looking at intersectional factors like gender, income, education, disability or ability, geographic location. All of these things compound the risk of exclusion, and they make those one-size-fits-all solutions pretty ineffective. And these inequalities, they reveal that access alone isn't enough. You have to think too about the fit between the person, their environment, and the digital task that they want or need to perform. So in this case, closing the digital divide means a bit more than just providing someone with a device. It means creating environments, both physical and digital, that support learning, offer ongoing assistance, and respect the lived experiences of older adults. Solutions have to go beyond the individual or the commercial interventions, right? They need to be embedded in broader systems and included in policy frameworks that promote accessibility, equity, and inclusion. So from a business perspective, closing the digital divide in Canada represents a pretty significant and growing opportunity. Older adults in Canada are, or I should say, older adults are Canada's fastest growing age group, and they're expected to comprise 25%, a quarter of the population very soon, with more than 1/3 living with a disability. Canadians with a physical disability already represent 15% of consumer spending. That's $165 billion a year. And that figure is it's projected, I should say, it's not going to, it's projected to rise to $316 billion by 2030. So expanding digital accessibility is going to allow businesses to tap into this very, very large, powerful, and expanding market. All right, about 7 or 8 slides ago, I showed the 7 priority areas very briefly that were identified by the Accessible Canada Act. And those 7 priority areas really help us identify where barriers exist, whether that's in communication or transportation, that sort of thing. The last slide I showed us some of those barriers themselves. This slide shows us the access rainbow model. And this is a model that can help us think through how access is constructed or blocked across not every, but across different levels of everyday life. So some quick background. as I said earlier, the Access Rainbow model is quite old. It's something that was developed in the mid-1990s by Andrew Clement and Leslie Shade as a framework to conceptualize universal access to information and communications infrastructure in Canada. It emerged in response to growing concerns that discussions of access and accessibility were overly focused on physical infrastructure. So things like network cables and devices, but they overlooked all of the really big things like social, economic, and political dimensions of access. So this model, the Access Rainbow model, it presents access or accessibility as a 7-layered structure, like a rainbow, where the colors or the layers are permeable and they blend into one another. As you can see, the Access Rainbow highlights that access must go beyond connectivity. It has to include things like content, literacy, policy, and social supports. And it provides a useful framework for us to start really interrogating our research and development. Thinking through all of these things takes a lot of time. I admit that. In our very fast-paced world, it takes a lot of courage and it takes a lot of self-discipline to take the time to do things right here. But taking the time and doing it right and thinking things through helps massively to de-risk our products so we don't end up creating things without a market. So let's break it down. The very bottom of our Access Rainbow said carriage facilities. What are carriage facilities? This is the infrastructure. This is things like broadband. It's the mobile and signal coverage that we have. And we need to think about things. We have questions to ask. Do our users have reliable internet or cell service? Where do they live? Does that impact connectivity? As we talked about earlier, broadband internet access is fragmented across Canada, and access is largely based on where you live and how much you can pay. The CRTC estimates that 90% or so of Canadians have access to broadband at 50 megabits per second for downloads. So that's a pretty decent speed. But that leaves us with 10% of the population, aka 1.6 million households with less stable or no access at all. And of these 1.6 million households, 1.5 million of these are located in rural areas. 26,000 are in northern communities, and 81,000 are on First Nations reserves. And this is 81,000 households, not individuals. So we think of the urban-rural divide as being exceptionally stark in Canada. And rural areas, like earlier we were saying 50 megabytes per second for downloads. In rural areas, it's entirely different. You're not looking at 50. You're seeing averages of 5.5. You can't do virtual care. You can't access virtual care when you're averaging 5.5 megabytes per second, or if you have no access at all. Devices. Well, let's actually move on with slide there. Devices. All right, what is it? Access to functional hardware. And when you think about this particular line, this particular stream of the rainbow, we need to think about things like what kinds of access or kind of devices do older adults have access to in your context? Are these affordable? Are they adaptable to changing physical or cognitive or psychosocial needs? So we talked about expensive internet before. Canada has one of the most expensive internet in the world, third most. And then when we add the rising cost of devices, we're seeing increased socioeconomic inequities that's leaving out a lot of older Canadians that are on a fixed income. Help Age, one of our AgeWell partners, estimated that communication devices and internet services cost an average of $1,000 a year at the very, very minimum. And that cost barrier, they estimate that means that only 54% of older adults in Canada have the means to participate in the digital world at home. Let's talk about wearable devices, for example. A wearable device that monitors changing heart function, body temperature, sleep patterns, and fall risk of value to me, to older adults? Yeah, absolutely it is. But when that device is well over $1,000, requires a monthly subscription and a data plan, but then also has tiny buttons and a really small screen, then you've already removed the majority of Canadians as your market. Even without all of that, think about a different kind of wearable. Does that device require a battery? If so, are you looking at a form factor that's large or potentially quite heavy or clunky? Because if so, how are you taking into account the changing physical needs or mobility challenges faced by a large percentage of older adults? Software tools. So these are things like operating systems, apps, platforms, things that we're developing a lot right now, right? Browsers, video calling software, things like that. And some of the questions that we need to ask ourselves here is, are these devices, are these compatible with assistive tech like screen readers or voice commands? How often do they need to update and are they difficult to manage? Stats Can reports that 80% of Canadians living with a disability use tech in some way. So that's the internet, that's a laptop, computers, tablet, etc., something like that, right? 18.2% of persons with disabilities said that it was, so the other 20% who didn't use tech in some way, 18% of those said that they didn't use technology in some way because of an ICT reason, because there is some sort of problem with the tech or access itself. So as we develop things, think about our apps. Do we have hidden text for screen readers? Does it understand voice commands? And if it does it understand our voices? I'm thinking of last week when I was late for a massage. Actually, I was running late. So I asked my phone to email my massage therapist, letting her know that I'm late. Unfortunately, I used the phrase email Tracy, and that email went to 3 to 4 different email addresses. Unfortunately, not all Tracy, my massage therapist. There are challenges here that come into play, right? So for screen readers, for example, you when you're creating something, you need to describe the images and provide transcripts for video. You need to follow a linear logical layout, build for keyboard use only, and write descriptive links in videos, right? There are lots of different things that you can do to improve here. Content services. What is this? This is the actual service that's being delivered here, right? So these are things like the telehealth platforms and the online banking systems. The questions to ask here as you're developing are things like, is this content relevant? Is it culturally appropriate? Is it stigmatizing? Is it easy to navigate? Are there instructions available in plain language and in multiple formats? I'm going to use fintech here as an example, because there is a huge, huge opportunity out there right now for fintech for older adults. The University of Manitoba recently put out I think it was a university blog post, basically, that said that 70% of older adults currently use banking apps. And then a Government of Canada report, this one's a little bit older, from 2021, that said that while older adults are using banking apps, they tend to not necessarily trust the technology or have a fear of the technology, because there's a lack of human interaction in online banking, and there's a reluctance to change the status quo. There are privacy worries, including frauds and scams. And then let's put another stat on that. An RBC survey said that 55% of Canadians, not only older Canadians here, but all Canadians, share their online passwords and debit card PINs. You can imagine why that happens, right? An older adult unsure of how to use a technology for banking here may ask for support from a family member or friend, which requires sharing an online password or a debit card PIN to help actually get their banking done. But when that happens, that leaves, in many cases, folks open to financial abuse, and it actually negates the user protections that most banks provide. And that leaves you liable when there are things happening in your account that you don't know about, like fraud. So to overcome problems like this, there are potential changes you can make, that banks can make to their apps, right? So they can do things like enabling users to pick the size of the text. Don't just kick users off the app without warning. Highlight the accessibility features that exist so that people know what's there. Um, Most phone operating systems, already allow us to customize text size, right? So we can make things bigger or smaller. But the banking apps don't do that. They don't actually follow that. So that compromises the ability of users with poor vision to engage with that content easily. So there's some like easy changes that you can make to those kinds of apps. So when you're thinking about creating or developing services and products, it's really, really important to think about that particular use case. In addition, let's think about whether something is culturally appropriate. And I'll pick up on that thought a little bit later as well. Services and supports. So what is it? This is training, this is tech support, this is community outreach. And this is the big implementation challenge that a lot of tech developers are faced with and where a lot of products actually fail, right? So the questions to ask here as you're developing things: what supports do users need to feel confident in using the technology that you're developing? And is help accessible or available in an accessible way, whether that's in person, by the phone, or multilingual? Because you may develop a thing, but you have to design for implementation. So what supports are in place for implementation and use, or installation and use? What happens when there's an error message? I can tell you right now, when I was caregiving from afar for my mother, when she got an error message on a thing, she just stopped using it and it went in a junk drawer on beside her bed, never to be seen again. It's where I found many pieces of technology, including wearable fall devices, at least 2 smartphones. There are problems with things like this without supports in place. Is there documentation that's easy to access and easy to read? Think about all of those terms and conditions of use and terms and conditions documents and instruction documents that we have online. They're so lengthy, no one ever reads to the bottom. I have never read to the bottom of one of those things. You just scroll all the way down and click accept. It's kind of the same thing with instruction manuals and kits, right? Simple to understand language, limit the number of solutions or multi-step solutions as much as possible. Let's go back to that fintech example. The last time I was at a physical bank, I waited for about 20 minutes in line while an older adult in front of me tried to explain a banking problem and then listened to the teller repeat, "You can do this on our app," while pointing at his phone, like repeatedly. And she just did this over and over again in an increasingly loud voice, and then increasingly slowly and loudly as well. So we see some very, very ageist behavior there. That's not helpful. It actually took another staff member taking the customer aside to show him how to use the banking app. And that's what that man needed: actual support and customer service. And that's the thing, as you're developing a thing, you need to think about as well. What are the services? What are the supports required to make your thing usable and user friendly at the same time? When it comes to these supports, are they accessible? And we think, for example, of older adults or those, for example, who live with dementias of multiple kinds, right? We know that with Alzheimer's, sometimes if someone is multilingual, they tend to revert back to their first language. So are there multilingual supports? These things, again, all very important to think about as you're developing. Literacy, what is it? Related to the last one, and this is the comfort with and understanding of digital technologies. And the questions to ask here are things like, do users have the skills and confidence to use the technology independently? Again, I'm using fintech as an example here. Independently is the key. And what assumptions are we making about, basic digital literacy skills? So literacy here, and doing well at this particular rainbow piece, this comes with knowing your audience and knowing your market. We always say that when you've spoken to one older adult, you've spoken to one older adult, and you've gotten information about one older adult. That's not data. That's one conversation. So stakeholder engagement is fundamentally one of the most important things you can and should be doing on a continuous basis. It's not a great practice or even a good practice to develop a thing and then test it out with your end users after. You need as much information as you can possibly get about pain points, about stigma, and about usability as you build. And these things, again, as I said, requires a lot of time and a lot of discipline and a lot of resources. But it's also sort of non-negotiable, right? If you want to design something that's both appropriate and accessible, you need to have the input of your end users throughout that whole process. Um, I will add that there are digital literacy programs out there that are run by community groups, that are run by libraries, that Help Age, for example, that they provide devices and they teach older adults how to use them. But your solution shouldn't have to depend on a third party training your user. You need to figure out where they're at in terms of digital literacy and design from there. And last, governance. What is this? This goes back to what I was talking about at the very beginning of the presentation. Do you know the laws, the policies, the standards and rights that apply to you as a business? Because those laws in Canada apply to you in the province where you're actually physically located, but also the provinces and where you're doing business. So if you don't know what those rules and regulations are, you should actually go figure that out. Because more than just focusing on the solution itself, this is also about thinking your own thinking about things like ethics and equity as well. Are you thinking about whether or not your technology considers and protects the rights and privacy of older adults? And are there policies in place to support inclusion and equitable access? Are you thinking of that as you're developing? Because designing or implementing AgeTech always involves value judgments, whether we recognize them or not. So are we thinking about surveillance and privacy? Are we thinking about whether or not the older adults are able to freely choose that technology, or is it being imposed upon them? Does that technology monitor users without their full awareness or ability to opt out? Lots of things to think about here when we think about governance, whether that's, out there in the policy realm, or whether that's, the way we're thinking about how our products are going to be used. Some last thoughts, and I powered through this, so we will have time for Q&A. Accessibility is multifaceted. Barriers can be physical, they can be digital, they can be systematic, they can be attitudinal or relational, and they often intersect to shape digital exclusion. The access rainbow that I sort of went through very quickly helps break down the layers of digital access, from infrastructure to device availability to governance to user literacy, and it offers a good starting point for evaluating and thinking about the accessibility of AgeTech. But accessibility also needs to be evaluated by how it supports older adults' sense of dignity, their sense of comfort, their sense of connection. Meaningful involvement of older adults in the research and design process is absolutely key to understanding and achieving this. So with that, I'm going to call it and say thank you. I am going to stop sharing slides, and we can have about 5 minutes of Q&A.
Great, thanks so much, Sam. Really wonderful presentation that I'm sure people will be referring back to, because there's a lot of material in there to kind of suss out. Will there be any future references to support and guide our HQP and other AgeWell members when it comes
Absolutely.
to understanding accessibility in AgeTech?
Thank you, Allison. That feels like a loaded question, but it goes back to what I was saying earlier at the very beginning of the presentation. We have put together a series of online courses that have a lot of these references available in them, but also more in-depth exploration of these topics. And not just an in-depth exploration of these topics, but ways that you can, or activities that encourage you to think about different ways, different models and frameworks that you can use to think about accessibility, to think about the digital divide, and think about inclusion and ethics as well. I will say that we already have a couple of these courses available. There's a designing with and for the LGBTQ community course already available. There's a researching, what is it? Researching with cognitive accessibility in mind course that's already available. This broader understanding accessibility course that this presentation is based on will be available sometime in the fall, so definitely keep an eye out on that. And then there are future courses coming down the pipeline. So things like understanding climate change, for example, when it comes to developing AgeTech, another extremely important topic when we think about accessibility of tech, when we think about ethics and equity, and whether or not what we're producing, what we're creating is there to make the world in a better place and not just creating, more plastic.
Great,
I
thanks,
think we have
Sam.
some guides as well. Allison, you might be the one to speak to this, but I believe we might have some guides and one-pagers available as well that individuals can access.
Yeah, on the knowledge base, we do have some guides, particularly when it comes to inclusive language. And yeah, there's a few guides there. So always important to remind our AgeWell members that you can access these resources on the members intranet. And you can always email us or me at training@agewell-nce.ca if you do have any questions. Or are looking for something specific and you don't know where to find it. That's what I'm here to help you with. So always feel free to reach out. We don't have
Yes,
any.
please do.
We don't have any. Oh wait, we do have a question in the Q&A. Okay, from Amy. Thank you for this work, Dr. Sandasi. I was wondering if you have any thoughts about universal accessibility, sometimes being seen as a silver bullet for one size fits all, or not.
Yes, I do have many thoughts here, and many rants have been had about this. Universal design is a wonderful ideal. Creating a product that is as accessible for as many people as possible without adaptation is a wonderful ideal, but it is not a silver bullet. It's not the only. It's not the only solution because you're still naturally excluding people who don't fit in that mold, right? So one of the things that I would like us to think about as designers is as we're designing a thing and thinking about creating, making it universally accessible, figuring out what the potential adaptations are to that particular design, thinking about different use cases, trying to break it, quite frankly, by different users with different use cases to see the best ways that something could be adapted and I guess hacked really in order to ensure that it's less exclusional. The other thing there is to have slightly more expansive product, let's say, supports that actually encourage and are okay with people hacking your product to make them more useful. People do this all the time. I mean, there's a whole website called IKEA Hackers, right? Of folks changing a built product to make it more useful to their use case. And I think we need to start thinking about our technologies like this as well, so that there are different ways that they can be used across different populations.
Great, thanks. And thanks for the question, Amy. There aren't any other questions yet. If you do have a question, please post in the Q&A box or in the chat, or you can raise your hand to ask a question verbally and we can unmute you. I have a quick question while we're giving our participants a little more time to think. Maybe not quick, I guess. But you were talking about taking the time to include these strategies in your research processes and in your design. What are some strategies that you would additionally recommend? We know that time is really hard for researchers to actually make. So there really needs to be, you gave a good business case for people to actually include these accessible designs and these strategies. But what are some ways that you can also kind of hack your way into including that, say, into grants or other sources of funding?
That's a great question. And it's actually something that comes up a lot when I speak with AgeWell's early career researchers. And that is write the time into your grants, write the stakeholder engagement into your grants from the very beginning so that you're actually creating both the space, the time, the in-person face-to-face interaction as well that allows for this sort of engagement. And stick to your guns, quite frankly, because as we can see with Tri-Council, the way they've been funding research recently has been focused on really emphasizing research that's translational. They want to see research that's going to make an impact in the real world at some point. And they know that this type of engagement, this type of co-creation is important. That's fundamental to creating that type of work. So our funders have recognized this, and now it's up to us to actually write that into our grants first and foremost. When it comes to being a trainee and doing this work, life is hard, man. You don't have a lot of time. You're teaching, you are doing courses yourself, you're collecting data. It's a lot of time and a lot of work, but I encourage you to make the time and include it in your methods because without that, I think you're missing some real richness to your data that could provide a much better data set, let's say, for you to work from as you develop and you design and you understand needs. And then for the startup and the entrepreneurship crew that may be here, I think that's your business case, right? It's your bottom line. If you want to create something that's actually going to be used and used by a lot of people, then you need to take the time to figure out what the people want. There are different ways when it comes to recruitment. So for those of you that are working with AgeWell projects, for example, AgeWell provides recruitment support. We will email your recruitment poster to our 5,000 older adults and caregivers that are part of our mailing list, for example. Organizations say, Arthritis Society or Cancer Care and things like that. Those organizations, if you're doing research in that field, sometimes they're going to support with participant recruitment as well. Just get out there and try to spam your recruitment to as many places as possible. For example, the Toronto Council on Aging will support recruitment too. For those of us in startups, this is a little bit difficult, right? Because typically these types of mailing lists aren't used to support commercial endeavors. But you can actually partner with some university institutions that offer this as a service and get them to help you with recruitment and getting feedback and setting up focus groups and things like that. And then also something that I learned from a colleague at U of T a few years ago, something he always said was to go talk to your friends and your family, right? Your circle is already there. You don't have to pay them for a focus group. Generally speaking, that is, but they're there to answer questions. And from there, there's a knock-on effect. You can get them to talk to their circle as well and end up with a much larger group of people providing inputs to your design than previously you may have had. So a few different options there, but it does take time, it does take work, and it does take money. So thinking about all of these things in advance planning, that advanced planning piece is really important because it's not necessarily something you can just catch up to later on.
Great. There aren't any more questions from the audience. So I'm going to close this AgeWell webinar. Thank you so much, Sam, for providing excellent strategies as well as concepts for people to move forward with their own AgeTech designs, especially from the first step. I will be sharing our link to the video as well as resources that you can access to support your further reading or understanding of this area. So thank you so much. Thanks to our participants for joining us today. We're very excited to have Sherry as well here from OACAC, just posted in the chat. We also want to remind people just briefly that we do have our conference coming up. Our call for abstracts are open and the submission deadline is July 18th. And registration is also open with the early bird deadline of August 13th. So be sure to check that out at agewell-nce.ca/conference. Okay, so thanks so much for all of our attendees and to Sam. We look forward to seeing you at our next AgeWell webinar. Have a great day, everybody.